actually from the Palestinian Animal League. I'll say that up front. I visited Palestine earlier in the year with the Palestinian Animal League on a political vegan tour of Palestine. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I learned through that experience. I've got an hour and I've got a lot I want to get through, but first off I really want to start by acknowledging three really important groups. Usually I hate using cue cards, I hate using notes, but since I'm speaking as an ally in this presentation, I will be using cue cards more than usual because I trust what I've written down beforehand more than what could possibly come out of my mouth at any given moment. So I will be reading off cue cards and I apologise for that. First off, I want to start by acknowledge that we stand today on land stolen from the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. They were the custodians of this land for tens of thousands of years before white settlers came and forcibly colonised what we now know as Australia. To this day, the land and culture of Indigenous Australians is in an active state of colonisation. I'm just going to change that slide. Sovereignty over this land has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, while recognising that respects means paying attention to the voices of Indigenous activists who spake out against colonisation. Next up, I want to recognise who is not in this room. We are here as animal activists, and yet as humans, we can only ever speak on behalf of or in solidarity with the group we fight for. In the future, I imagine that these kind of conferences would happen on sanctuaries, where we can share the space with the very animals we are advocating for. But for now, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and recognise these animals. I want to take a moment for all of us to feel their pain and their fury, recognising the ways in which they resist their exploitation every day. I also want to take a moment to remember the animals who have been freed or who have freed themselves, and to acknowledge all the animals who live amongst us with minimal human interference. These animals are pioneers, and they show us what could be possible. Today is a chance to listen to the voices of all animals and pay attention to when human greed, ambition or ego is getting in the way of letting them be heard. Finally, I want to acknowledge one more group before I get stuck into what this presentation is all about. So as you probably gathered by the title of this presentation, today I will be speaking about the animal rights movement in occupied Palestine and what we can learn from the incredible work being done by the Palestinian Animal League. However, as you probably gathered by looking at me, I am not Palestinian. So I visited Palestine in March this year on a political vegan tour of Palestine, which was run by the Palestinian Animal League. And I believe it's kind of my duty to share what I learned there with my community. And it is also absolutely my privilege. Before I begin this presentation, I want to take the time to acknowledge the active oppression of Palestinian people, as well as the continuous colonization of their land, food, and culture. Due to the colour of my skin and the country I was born in, I have the luxury to speak out about the atrocities committed against Palestinian people, a luxury denied to most of those living under occupation. Palestinians are at the forefront of their own resistance, and I do not pretend to be an expert on their situation. But I do have a voice denied to many, and today I'll be using it to elevate the lessons I learned from Palestinian activists. At the conclusion of this talk, I will provide some links to resources written by Palestinian activists, artists, and academics, and I would highly recommend that everyone took the time to check these out. So now I invite everyone to close your eyes. If you don't feel comfortable closing your eyes, just look down at the ground, look at the wall, kind of take a couple of deep breaths, and try and center yourself in the space that we're in. Now, I want you to imagine a country whose name appears on few maps, despite it existing for thousands of years. I want you to imagine a land of hard rock, rugged mountains, and deep valleys. Breathe in and imagine your lungs being filled with the smell of za'atar, wild thyme which grows on the mountains. and of warm bread baked fresh over a hot stone. Imagine the sound of a bustling marketplace, laughter, voices shouting, enticing you to pick their products, the sizzling sound of falafel being cooked fresh. Imagine the rich reds and yellows and browns of a spice store, where the spices are built into towers of colour and dried dates hang from the ceiling. Now I want you to put all of this together. Imagine this land full of warmth, generosity, love, and food, and add to it a constant, ever-present backdrop of gunshots. This is Palestine. Imagine a land where children play in the wreckage of homes destroyed by bombs. Imagine a school built by the UN for Palestinian children, riddled with bullets, because it stands opposite a guard post and Israeli soldiers, children themselves, get bored. Imagine a family having lost a brother or cousin or daughter to Israeli bombs, forced to sleep for 1 month in the ruins of their home before they're allowed to rebuild. Imagine hunger and thirst and the constant threat that water will run out, despite the fact that the taps of your oppressors run clear and limitless. Imagine being born into a refugee camp and knowing you may never see the town that you still call your home. Imagine holding the key that your grandparents used to last lock the door of their homes when they were driven from them 70 years ago, and vowing that one day you will return to your home, a right that all have under international human rights law. Imagine working for months to get a visa to see your dying mother who lives 2 towns over, only be turned away at the border by an 18-year-old soldier with a rifle. He gives no reason. Imagine a country where tourists sit on an air-conditioned bus at a checkpoint while locals line up to have their identity cards examined. Imagine being strip searched at that same checkpoint by a soldier wearing vegan leather boots who, if interviewed, would claim she was against exploitation of all species. Imagine a country where those who lead are taught since childhood that they are superior, that Palestinians are terrorists, that we need to protect our people. Imagine these children then being handed guns. Imagine a people filled with resistance who face guns with stones and turn tear bomb canisters into jewelry they sell to tourists. Imagine a people filled with pride who resist their oppressors every day and are killed for this resistance. Imagine a country filled with love and warmth and a people who fight for their right to exist. This is Palestine. I'd like everyone to open their eyes now. So Palestine is a land of contradictions, where heavily armed military stand shoulder to shoulder with blushing brides, where different faiths occupy the same buildings, yet are divided by walls and mistrust, and where food is both a celebration and an act of resistance. And amidst all of this political tension and pressure, sits the Palestinian Animal League. So PAL was founded in 2011, and they're the only animal rights organisation that operates within occupied Palestinian territories. So PAL is based in Ramallah, which is the economic capital of Palestine. So Jerusalem is the spiritual capital of Palestine, Ramallah is the economic capital. So that's where trade happens, that's where a lot of students live. It's kind of, I guess it's considered the most modern city in Palestine. PAL are based there, they have their offices there, and have their vet clinic there. So the PAL are responsible for a number of community and outreach programs, all centred around animal rights and welfare. So I've listed some of their programs here. They include their vet clinic, so this delivers medical care to stray animals in Ramallah, so anyone can bring an animal along to PAL's vet clinic and they'll treat them. And they also work with working and domestic animals. They run community and youth programs, including Youth for Change, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, but basically it aims to break the cycle of violence that is generated from intergenerational trauma and end the normalization of violence, which kind of occurs in villages due to the constant presence of soldiers. So PAL runs programs to help young people recognize their feelings of anger and express them in healthy ways, so rather than through violence. So what they found is that often young people would be exposed to violence through soldiers in the villages. They would then go to the villages and they'd take out this violence on stray dogs, particularly because there's a big link between Palestinians and fear of dogs, which I'm going to talk about again in a minute. And then those same young people would grow up and be violent to their partners, and that would cause this kind of cycle of violence, which PAL recognised and decided they wanted to intervene on. So additionally, PAL runs regular events promoting a vegan lifestyle, many of which are run by youth, as well as recognising and responding to local animal welfare issues. So what PAL does, really interestingly, is they work with a lot of local people, they work within their community. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the ways that they've really innovated community and grassroots activism, which I really think we could benefit from in Australia, because they are in the midst of occupation. They are working with groups who are often not very open to considering issues outside their own oppression. So the way they deal with that is really inspiring and incredible. So I'm going to be touching on some key things, particularly how they work within communities, how they work with other communities such as the Bedouin tribes, and how they kind of navigate belonging to multiple movements at once. So PAL consider themselves they consider animal, land and human oppression as being interlinked, and everything that they do recognises and acknowledges that. So all of these programs are run in collaboration with their local community, and they're championed by locals, so that empowers them to make a difference in their community. So I could talk for a long time about the work of PAL, and I will share a bit more about them as I'm going through, as I get to what lessons we can learn. But there's one thing that they do that I want to draw particular attention to, as it really encapsulates their style of activism. So this picture is really adorable, but it's actually, in addition to that, it's actually evidence of a really interesting and innovative outreach strategy that PAL uses. So in Palestine, many people have a deep fear of dogs, as Israeli soldiers have been known to use dogs against Palestinians to attack protesters or bystanders. So in Palestine, there's a lot of street dogs, there's a lot of street cats, and PAL has been very open about acting. They act as a vet clinic, they don't act as a shelter, because in their belief, they consider it better for dogs and cats to be able to roam free and live their lives rather than to sit in a cage in their shelter. So, and that's their belief, and it works for them, especially for cats. Cats are really loved in the community. Cats don't belong to anyone. They roam freely, they're fed by everyone, whoever they kind of happen to pick to sleep with that night. So, but dogs, on the other hand, aren't treated as well because of that deep-seated fear. So PAL kind of saw this, and they saw that they wanted to maintain the street dogs' autonomy. They wanted them to be able to live their lives, they wanted them to be able to be respected and treated with dignity, and they also wanted the Palestinian people to kind of break down that fear and understand that they have more in common with these dogs than they do with the Israeli soldiers who were using them against them. So what they did, so street dogs often become victims of violence in the villages as people express that kind of internalized rage out against someone who's a lot smaller than them because they can't attack a soldier. So PAL recognised this, and they realised that in order to make their community safer for street dogs, they needed to break down this fear response. They realised that the best way to do this was to start with children. So when I visited PAL in March, there was a puppy there. His name was Axe. This is me and Axe. He was adorable as well. He was so gorgeous, friendly, loving, and for everyone at PAL, he not only represented someone who they could help, he represented an opportunity. So while we were there, we were sitting around at PAL's offices, and 3 local boys came over. They'd been invited by the Palestinian Animal League to come and just simply play with Axe. So we kind of thought, we were sitting there and we're like, oh, that's cool. That's, some kids playing with a dog. And then we realized how terrified these young boys were. They were about 11 years old, and they were shrinking away from this tiny puppy. They were absolutely terrified. So they were so scared, they ran away from the puppy. They attempted to strike him sometimes when he kind of ran at them to try and play. And we were there for about half an hour. And during this time, something changed. So by the end of the time that we were there, both boys and puppies were playing together happily. They were wrestling in the grass. When it got too rough, the volunteers from the Palestinian Animal League would step in and kind of say, like, how about we treat the dog like this instead, and they would, step in when Axe was getting a bit too excited, as you can see from this photo. Axe loved to tear skin apart. I left with many bruises, but it was very much worth it. So this vision of a world where humans live in harmony with other species is so representative of power and what they believe in. And for me, this story demonstrates the deep respect power has for both humans and for other species, and how they believe that these need to work in tandem. So respect needs to happen simultaneously. So now we get to the guts of this presentation. It's kind of, it's all well and good for me to talk about how incredible Pal is, how incredible Palestine is, and I've already made this clear, I think. But as you might be thinking, it's pretty different over there to how it is here. But it's not really. We're a country that also is in a state of active colonization. Most of us in this room probably benefit from that. And the lessons we can learn from what Palestine is doing are lessons that we can not only apply to our relationship with Indigenous Australians, but which we can apply to connecting to communities that differ from ours, from creating coalitions with other activist groups, and from building this movement into one that is strong, one that bridges boundaries, one that encourages people to work together to identify the way all of our issues kind of have these root causes and attack the root causes rather than the symptoms. So what can we learn from the work of PAL? And what elements of their activism could we potentially benefit from bringing to our movement in Australia? So for our remaining time together, I'm going to offer some of my ideas and my perspectives on some things that I learned, some things that I would love to see brought back to Australia. So first off, know your audience. So PAL, as I said, they are in Ramallah. They're in the centre of the economic capital. So as you can imagine, people living there, they're a bit more privileged. Like there's still a refugee camp in Ramallah. There might actually be two. I know definitely of one. I visited one. But people are a little bit more, they have more of a capacity to be politically engaged. So they're kind of sitting at the centre of this place where debate is happening a lot. There's people around who, completely anti-occupation. There's people who might be more centrist in their views. They might be more like, we need to kind of be good Palestinians. We need to show them that we're good enough to have basic human rights. So there's debate happening all the time about what it means to live under occupation, what political action should be taken, just like we see in Australia, except the difference is when people take political action in Ramallah, they are shot. So when we were there, actually, we were there on a Friday, and we were walking down the street, and one of the streets was blockaded. And we were asked why. It was blockaded by Israeli soldiers. And they said, it's a Friday. So Friday's a day of rest for Palestinians, it's the weekend. The road that they blockaded was an entry to a Palestinian refugee camp. It was the only road in. The other way to get in was you had to go around kind of mountains. And if you didn't have a four-wheel drive, if we were lucky to be in a four-wheel drive, then it was pretty impossible. And there was also a wedding happening right next to the blockade. So we were standing there watching this happen, and the tension was palpable. So as we were standing there, Israeli soldiers had rifles slung over their shoulders. They were walking back and forth, and Palestinian people began to gather. So there were children from the refugee camps, there were their parents, they were holding stones, they were holding slingshots, they were standing around. We were kind of standing there a bit awkwardly, like, should we be here? What's going to happen? Is this safe? Are we making them unsafe? And they were like, no, just take pictures. A lot of the Palestinians were taking selfies with us, with the Israeli guards in the background. We're like, this is great, cool, what's going on? And then they were like, don't worry, we'll get you out before the wedding finishes. And we're like, okay, what does that have to do with anything? And they said, the children will never throw stones while the wedding's happening. They respect the wedding too much. After the wedding finishes, that's when things are going to happen. And we actually learned later that a boy was shot that day later on after the wedding had finished. He was shot in his knees. So we were sent a picture of him with someone that our guide knew. And it's interesting that he was shot in the knees because a high-up Israeli official is actually on the record saying that he had plans to create a generation of crippled Palestinians with the intent that if they can't walk, they can't resist. So this was happening in Ramallah, minutes from Powell's offices. So they exist in a state of tension all the time. So it is essential that they know who they're working with. They know their cultural triggers. They're all Palestinian, of course, but as we know, as animal activists, sometimes you can get caught up in your own community. You can forget what's happening outside of it. What is happening for other people who aren't in your community. It's so easy to do because we get caught in our echo chambers. We forget to speak to people who aren't activists. We can forget to speak to people who are activists in different areas. And I think there's some great presentations about building alliances between different movements, which I think are really essential for this kind of thing. So they need to know their cultural triggers. And one of those, like I just said, it's dogs. They know that there's this deep-seated Palestinian, this fear between Palestinians and dogs. So knowing that, they can start to address that. They know that some people do not have the capacity to make the kind of change that they want to see. So Pal, like most of us in this room, I would imagine, are intensely anti-speciesist. They believe that any exploitation, any use of animals is wrong. However, they know that there are people in their community who can't meet them at that point. So for example, the Bedouin tribes, they're nomadic tribes, they live in the desert. There, they suffer, they struggle under occupation just as much as anyone else, probably more so because they don't have this kind of rights that come with living in a kind of dwelling. So they use working animals, they use donkeys, they use camels. Powell, of course, would prefer that they did not do this. However, they recognize that these people are facing extreme oppression and that they are not at a place to currently make the changes that they ideally would want to see. So instead, what they did is they created the first ever in Palestine, document for caring for working animals. They provided it to the Bedouins. So for the first time, these people had laid out for them warning signs of when a donkey was becoming dehydrated. Things like load limits, like what is an average donkey's, what can they carry without severely injuring their back. Things like what to do in cases of emergency. And a lot of these things are things that the Bedouin have figured out for themselves, but they didn't have access to the kind of modern vet kind of knowledge, Pal has vets with them, they have their vet clinic, they didn't have access to things like medication, and also a lot of things are being denied to them. So usually the Bedouins would move a long way and they would take the animals with them, but what Israeli soldiers do is they make them leave their working animals at checkpoints, so they have to leave them for hours in the sun. So Powell kind of gave them guidelines on how to mitigate this, what to do, how to provide water, what to do in emergencies. And so for the first time, this was something that was being addressed. And it wasn't the perfect solution, of course, but it was meeting their audience where they were at. They also, when you know your audience, you recognize connections. So something that's really big in Palestine is food sovereignty. So I talked earlier about za'atar. So Palestinians are forbidden from harvesting za'atar. So za'atar grows wild on the mountainside, and Palestinians for generations have harvested it and they use it in a lot of their cooking. And I have a friend who's Brazilian and she says she used to buy Palestinian za'atar in Palestine, take it back to Brazil and it would never taste the same. It's special. I have za'atar here now and I'm it's trying, but it's not quite right. So they used to harvest this. Basically, Za'atar is a food staple, so kids for breakfast would have bread with za'atar. You'd have it for every meal. It's just on the table. It's just iconic. It's something that is at the core of Palestinian culture. So to kind of assist in their colonization progress, as we always see, food became part of the Israeli government's plan, their colonization plan. So they banned Palestinians from harvesting wild za'atar. A lot of them still do. A lot of them are arrested. But when we look at that, Powell can recognize that that's a connection. A lot of Palestinians' food, a lot of their culture is based in plant-based food. Really, if you go to Palestine, they will only try and serve you an animal because they feel that they need to. A lot of them are living in states of poverty. Eating animals is something that the rich do. Eating animals is something that is reserved for higher-ups. So a lot of their kind of the food and the culture that is really core to them is based around plant-based food. So when Powell can recognize that, they can join movements for food sovereignty, they can join resistance against food-based colonization, and they can help spread this message that animal rights is not only about one type of person, it's not only about people who have the capacity to care about these animals. It's about our lives as well. It's about how we respect the earth. So when they know their audience, they can find those connections. They can find those touch points, those things that everyone cares about that happen to be in line with their values as well. And I think that's something that's really important when we're talking about activism in Australia. When we think about those cultural things, those iconic touch points that everyone cares about. Because we can run a campaign and it can be about something that we all would agree is morally wrong. But if the rest of society doesn't understand how it's relevant to them, it's not going to get very far. But when we are connected, when we know our audience, we can build campaigns that influence everyone, that touch everyone, that have a symbolic meaning for the biggest percentage of people. So next up, I touched on this already, but community is key. So PAL centers themselves in their community. They don't distance themselves. They don't operate as their own little kind of thing in their offices and it was kind of invite only. They're in the community all the time. So they identify their needs and they tailor their programs to address the needs of the community while also raising awareness for their cause. So a great example of this is Youth for Change. So I mentioned a bit earlier, it's that idea of breaking the cycle of violence. So what PAL did with this, they identified that the community was experiencing difficulty with domestic violence and community violence. And they kind of followed that back. They kind of going down the rabbit hole and they were like, where does this come from? Domestic violence, community violence, where does this start? So they realized that children were being exposed to violence from a really young age. There were gunshots every night. Tear gas canisters were being thrown into the camp. They would see soldiers beating one of their classmates. So they were being exposed to this kind of violence and that leaves a mark. So then they were going into their community and they were filled with this rage, this sense of injustice. They were seeing their peers being killed. There were walls with names of martyrs on them and they were raised to know that they were oppressed. They were raised to understand that they weren't allowed to go home ever. So they were filled with this rage and this violence. What do? They can throw stones at soldiers, they get shot. So a lot of the time they took out that violence on the dogs, on the cats, on the individuals in society who couldn't really fight back. And this also led to a desensitization of violence. So there used to be a lot of public slaughter in Ramallah and in other villages. So cows, sheep, they would be killed in the public, in the village. And everyone was just desensitized to this. Blood on the streets was so normalized. People didn't even think about it. People didn't even worry about it. So when you kind of think of that, they saw that, and then they realized how that desensitization would lead to domestic violence, would lead to community violence. So they decided to go back to the roots. They decided to work with youth. So they created this program. They created this program to disrupt